Hey everyone! Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating periods in history, the Italian Renaissance. This incredible era, spanning from the late 14th century to around 1600, marked the transition between the Middle Ages and the start of modern Europe. The word Renaissance itself means rebirth in French, rinascimento in Italian. This era is famous for its revival of the culture of classical antiquity, a stark contrast to what the Renaissance humanists called the Dark Ages. Interestingly, the term Renaissance wasn't actually used until the 19th century, thanks to historians like Jacob Burckhardt. The Italian Renaissance kicked off in Tuscany, particularly in Florence and Siena. It then spread to cities like Venice, where scholars found new texts from ancient Greece. The height of the Renaissance in Italy was in the late 15th century, but foreign invasions eventually caused turmoil. However, the ideas and ideals of the Renaissance spread across Europe, influencing the Northern Renaissance and the English Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance is celebrated for its cultural achievements. We're talking about literary giants like Petrarch, Castiglione, and Machiavelli, legendary artists such as Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, and architectural masterpieces like Florence's Duomo and St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Now, let's talk about the socio-economic background. By the late Middle Ages, central and southern Italy, once the heart of the Roman Empire, were much poorer than the north. Rome was in ruins, and the Papal States were barely governed. This led the papacy to move to Avignon in France. Southern cities like Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia were under foreign rule. In contrast, northern Italy was thriving. The Crusades had created lasting trade routes to the Levant, and the Fourth Crusade weakened the Byzantine Empire as a commercial rival to cities like Venice and Genoa. Northern Italy's development, spurred by trade, made it one of the wealthiest regions in Europe, with Florence as a prime example of prosperity. Italian trade routes across the Mediterranean were not just for goods but also for ideas and knowledge. During medieval times, classical Greek learning trickled into Western Europe through Arab translations. The Crusades and the Reconquista of Moorish Spain brought even more classical knowledge to northern Italy. The 13th century was an economic boom time for Europe, and Italian city-states grew in power, becoming almost entirely independent from the Holy Roman Empire. This period saw the development of modern commercial infrastructure, including joint stock companies, international banking, foreign exchange markets, insurance, and government debt. Florence became the financial hub, and its gold florin was the main currency for international trade. As cities grew, the decline of feudalism and the rise of trade went hand in hand. Wealthy merchants gained control of city-state governments, boosting trade even more. However, the 14th century brought a series of disasters, including climate change-induced famines, the Hundred Years' War, and the expansion of the Ottoman Empire disrupting trade routes. The most devastating was the Black Death, which decimated populations across Europe, including the bustling cities of northern Italy. Florence, for instance, lost 25 to 50% of its population. During this period of instability, early Renaissance figures like Dante and Petrarch emerged, and the first signs of Renaissance art appeared with Giotto's realism. Ironically, these calamities helped set the stage for the Renaissance. The Black Death led to a smaller, wealthier population with more money to spend on luxury goods like art and architecture. Additionally, the fall of older banking families allowed the Medici to rise to prominence in Florence. And now let's dive into the development of the Renaissance in northern Italy. This region was divided into numerous warring city-states, the most powerful being Milan, Florence, Pisa, Siena, Genoa, Ferrara, and Venice. During the High Medieval period, northern Italy was also split by the ongoing struggle for supremacy between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. Each city aligned with one faction or the other and was further divided internally between the Guelphs and Ghibellines, the two warring parties. Warfare between the states was common, but invasions from outside Italy were rare. usually limited to intermittent incursions by Holy Roman emperors. Renaissance politics emerged from this tumultuous background. From the 13th century onward, armies were primarily composed of mercenaries, allowing prosperous city-states to field considerable forces despite their low populations. By the 15th century, the most powerful city-states began annexing their smaller neighbors. For instance, Florence took Pisa in 1406, Venice captured Padua and Verona, and the Duchy of Milan annexed areas like Pavia and Parma. Focusing on Florence under the Medici, in the late 14th century, the leading family was the Albizzi. Their main rivals were the Medici, first led by Giovanni de' Medici and then by his son Cosimo. The Medici controlled the largest bank in Europe at the time and had various enterprises in Florence and beyond. In 1433, the Albizzi managed to exile Cosimo, but a pro-Medici signoria was elected the next year, allowing Cosimo to return. The Medici then became the dominant family in Florence, holding power for the next 3 centuries. Although Florence remained a republic until 1537, marking the end of the High Renaissance in the city, the Medici and their allies effectively controlled the instruments of republican government, except during the brief intervals after 1434 and 1527. Cosimo and Lorenzo rarely held official posts, but they were the undisputed leaders. Cosimo de' Medici was highly popular among the citizens for bringing stability and prosperity to Florence. One of his significant achievements was negotiating the Peace of Lodi with Francesco Sforza, ending decades of war with Milan and bringing stability to much of northern Italy. Cosimo was also a major patron of the arts, both directly and indirectly, by setting an example. After Cosimo's death, his sickly son Piero de' Medici took over, but died after 5 years in power. In 1469, Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo, took charge at the age of 21. Known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, he was the first family member educated in the humanist tradition from a young age and is best remembered as one of the Renaissance's most important patrons of the arts. And now let's explore how Renaissance ideals spread beyond northern Italy. Initially, these ideas traveled from Florence to neighboring Tuscan states like Siena and Lucca. Tuscan culture quickly became the model for all northern Italian states, and the Tuscan dialect of Italian dominated literature in the region. In 1447, Francesco Sforza took control of Milan, transforming it into a significant center of art and learning, attracting figures like Leon Battista Alberti. Venice, one of the wealthiest cities due to its control of the Mediterranean, also emerged as a hub of Renaissance culture, particularly in architecture. Smaller courts in cities like Ferrara, Mantua under the Gonzaga, and Urbino under Federico da Montefeltro fostered Renaissance patronage and developed their unique artistic styles. In Naples, the Renaissance flourished under Alfonso I, who conquered the city in 1443 and supported artists like Francesco Laurana and Antonello da Messina, as well as writers such as the poet Jacopo Sannazaro and humanist scholar Angelo Poliziano. The papacy returned to Rome in 1378, but the city remained poor and in ruins during the early Renaissance. The transformation began under Pope Nicholas V, who became pontiff in 1447 and initiated a major rebuilding effort. This renewal continued under Pope Pius II, previously known as humanist scholar Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini. As wealthy northern families like the Medici and the Borgias gained control of the papacy, Renaissance art and philosophy permeated the Vatican. Pope Sixtus IV continued the rebuilding, famously commissioning the construction of the Sistine Chapel. The popes also became more secular rulers as they centralized power in the papal states, led by a series of warrior popes. By the late 15th century, the nature of the Renaissance began to shift. The ruling classes and aristocracy fully embraced Renaissance ideals. While early Renaissance artists were seen as craftsmen with little prestige, later Renaissance figures wielded significant influence and could command high fees. This period saw a thriving trade in Renaissance art. Initially, Many leading artists came from lower or middle-class backgrounds, but increasingly they rose to aristocratic status. Despite its cultural impact, the Renaissance affected only a small portion of the population. Northern Italy was the most urbanized region in Europe, but 3/4 of the people were still rural peasants, living much as they had during the Middle Ages. Feudalism was not as prominent in northern Italy, with peasants typically working on private farms or as sharecroppers. Some scholars suggest a trend toward refeudalization in the later Renaissance as urban elites became landed aristocrats. In cities, the situation was different. Urban areas were dominated by a commercial elite, as exclusive as any medieval aristocracy. This group was the primary patron and audience for Renaissance culture. Below them, a large class of artisans and guild members enjoyed comfortable lives and held significant power in republican governments. Unlike elsewhere in Europe, where artisans were lower class, these literate and educated individuals participated in Renaissance culture. However, the largest segment of the urban population consisted of semi-skilled workers and the unemployed, who were largely untouched by the Renaissance. Therefore, the Renaissance was not a period of broad social or economic change, but rather one of cultural and ideological development. It only reached a small fraction of the population, leading some modern historians, particularly those following historical materialism, to downplay its significance in human history, preferring to think of the period as early modern Europe instead. And now let's talk about the end of the Italian Renaissance. Just like its beginning, pinpointing the exact end of the Renaissance is tricky. For some, it ended with the rise of the austere monk Girolamo Savonarola in 1497. Savonarola capitalized on the backlash against the secularism and extravagance of the Renaissance. During his brief rule in Florence, many artworks were destroyed in the infamous Bonfire of the Vanities. However, others see the Medici's return to power as the start of a new phase in the arts known as Mannerism. The Medici, now Grand Dukes of Tuscany, oversaw a church counter-movement. In 1542, the Sacred Congregation of the Inquisition was formed, and shortly after, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum banned many Renaissance works of literature. Another significant factor in the end of the Renaissance was the loss of stability due to a series of foreign invasions known as the Italian Wars. These invasions began in 1494, when France invaded northern Italy, causing widespread destruction and ending the independence of many city-states. The most devastating blow came on May 6, 1527, when Spanish and German troops sacked Rome. This event nearly ended the papacy's role as a major patron of Renaissance art and architecture for 2 decades. As the Italian Renaissance declined, its ideals and styles found new life in the Northern Renaissance. Many of Italy's greatest artists emigrated, with Leonardo da Vinci famously moving to France in 1516. Teams of lesser-known artists who transformed the Château de Fontainebleau created the Fontainebleau School, which infused Italian Renaissance style into French art. From there, these new styles, influenced by Mannerism, spread to Antwerp and then throughout Northern Europe. This northward spread of Renaissance ideas reflected a broader shift. The Mediterranean was no longer Europe's primary trade route. In 1498, Vasco da Gama's voyage to India marked the start of the primary trade route shifting to the Atlantic ports of Lisbon, Seville, Nantes, Bristol, and London. These regions quickly surpassed Italy in wealth and power.